Let's strip away the neon-lit surface of modern geopolitics, finance, and domestic policy for today's explainer. Because if there's one overarching theme to the deep dive we're about to take, it's this. Things are fundamentally not as they seem. We're going to look at information from a variety of sources, suggesting that the systems we rely on every single day are quietly undergoing massive, hidden transformations.
Right off the bat, let me ask you something. What do crypto regulations, foreign defense budgets, and municipal tax software all have in common? At first glance, you'd think absolutely nothing. They seem like completely isolated data points. But as we dig into our sources today, we're finding that they're actually deeply interconnected pieces of a very quiet, systemic shift in global power.
Section 1. The Web3 Decentralization Illusion. Let's start with a massive financial sleight of hand happening right now in the cryptosphere. It's a space where privatization is, quite brilliantly, being sold to the public as decentralization. You know the original promise of Web3, right? It was supposed to be an escape hatch, a place for true, uncensorable individual sovereignty. But ironically, while retail investors cheer for new legislation like the Clarity Act, hoping it's going to send their tokens to the moon, sources argue this actually does the exact opposite. By removing specific accounting hurdles known as SAB 121, which were rules that previously kept banks from holding crypto, it basically paves the way for traditional banking giants to build a highly controlled new Fed. We're talking over 140 private equity firms quietly taking control of the monetary steering wheel.
The institutional reality doesn't want hypervolatility. They definitely don't want a speculative lottery ticket. What they want is to pool liquidity and hoover up treasury yields by minting compliant, institutional stablecoins like OUSD. This allows them to move billions of dollars at a fraction of a cent in on-chain costs. So what's the catch? Well, meanwhile, retail users are legally walled off from true financial freedom, ironically cheering for the very regulations that are building those walls.
Section 2. Banking's broken social contract.
So to understand how these financial giants gained the power to essentially rewrite the rules of the ledger, we have to look back at the historical erosion of the banking social contract. Legal scholar Marisa Bardaran points out that banks originally gained government protection in exchange for operating safely and serving their local communities. Back in the colonial era of 1781, banks had real, distinct civic duties. In the 1930s, under the New Deal, strict regulations maintained that safety. But fast forward to the 1990s and 2000s, this arrangement aggressively morphed into a deregulatory phase. It became all about flexibility, wildly complex risk models, and the rise of institutions that are simply too big to fail.
Early on, a bank charter was literally seen as a covenant, a real social contract between the state and the bank. The government provided protection from panics, and in return, the bank provided civic utility. But walk into a megabank today and, well, things are not as they seem. The government's paramount objective has arguably completely shifted away from public utility toward merely assuring bank profitability.
This dynamic is perfectly captured when we look back at the 2008 financial crisis. During the bailouts, programs like the Home Affordable Modification Program, HAMP, were ostensibly sold to the public as a lifeline for struggling homeowners. But behind the scenes, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner infamously stated that the program was actually meant to foam the runway for the massive banks to absorb foreclosures. Essentially, a public program was used to cushion the landing for the very institutions that caused the crash.
Section 3. Redefining global military aid.
Now, this exact same theme of shifting accountability and obscuring reality appears in the military-industrial complex, specifically within Sections 219 and 224 of the drafted National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. The surface narrative portrays this as standard support for a longtime ally, Israel. But again, things are not as they seem. Analysts warn it's actually a permanent integration of defense tech, like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Traditional military aid is debated by Congress and capped by 10-year agreements with transparent top-line numbers. But this new model shifts funding into opaque procurement channels, utilizing undefined terms like data fusion that effectively bypass traditional public oversight.
Ben Freeman from the Quincy Institute hits the nail on the head, warning of what he calls a jobs trap. See, by spreading foreign-linked defense manufacturing footprints across local congressional districts right here in the U.S., it becomes a local political asset. Once those jobs exist in a lawmaker's district, disentangling those military ties becomes politically impossible, no matter how foreign policy interests might diverge down the road.
This loss of transparency and the creation of what investigators are calling an accountability gap has sparked intense bipartisan outrage among the public. On military news sites, commenters are literally labeling these moves as open treason, citing severe compromises to national sovereignty. The public is feeling a profound disconnect between what is being legislated and the constitutional sovereignty of the nation.
Section 4. Software as Sovereign Threat. This brings us to perhaps the most provocative forensic argument presented in our sources, the concept that in the 21st century, sovereignty is no longer stolen with bullets, but with bytes. Think about it. In the 18th century, overthrowing a government meant kinetic warfare, physically seizing forts and capitals with actual troops. But forensic analysts in our sources argue that today, non-kinetic subversion through algorithmic manipulation functions, like the flip function or base 8 modular tags, can forcibly displace the sovereign will of the people just as effectively. The instrument has changed entirely, but the constitutional injury is identical.
According to legal documents and forensic experts cited in our materials, this forms what they call the triad of systemic moral hazard. They allege this is an interconnected, software-enabled scheme. You have renegade software inflating property valuations, which drives up unpayable municipal bonds. We're talking $5.1 trillion in debt, while hidden distortion logic synthetically engineers election outcomes. Together, this triad artificially extracts wealth and nullifies the voice of the voting public through totally invisible code.
The core legal argument here hinges on the functional equivalence principle. It essentially states that if a coordinated software operation systematically falsifies the mechanism by which the people choose their rulers, it is legally and functionally equivalent to levying war against the state. Now, we are objectively mapping out these extreme claims today rather than endorsing them, but the argument insists that compromised digital infrastructure must be treated as a highest-level national security threat.
Section 5. The macro convergence.
When we pull all of these distinct data streams together, the crypto shifts, the opaque defense spending, the domestic software concerns, we hit the macro convergence. We realize the geopolitical war and the financial war are actually the exact same conflict, just fought in different domains. As this quote brilliantly captures, the global conflicts involving Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and Iran are not just territorial. They're intimately tied to a frantic race to control the foundational layer of digital settlement, because to enforce sanctions and truly project global power, major nations absolutely must control the ledger where the money moves.
And that leads to a massive global fracture. As BRICS nations legally adopt crypto to aggressively pave new international trading roads completely outside of Western sanctions, traditional Western giants are rushing to annex the ledger. They are building a strict, walled garden using institutional stablecoins, biometric locks, and massive KYC constraints to trap capital inside. It all comes back to our theme. Things are not as they seem. The whole push for crypto clarity isn't about freeing the user. It's about building the walls of that garden. So what does this all mean for us? We have to end with this critical question. As military technology fuses with opaque procurement, as financial ledgers are quietly captured by private equity, and as the very software that counts our votes is alleged to be fundamentally compromised, exactly whose system are we inheriting? When the architecture of illusion finally collapses, will we even have the power to rebuild it? Keep questioning the surface, and I'll catch you next time.